Welcome to Recross the Paths. My name is Cade, and today my guest is D.S.B. Welcome, D.S.B.
It's a pleasure to be here. And again, it's just an honor and a privilege to be a part of this wonderful community. And I just want to say also, I listened to some of your previous episodes, and you just have this incredible, just a Congo line of beautiful and intelligent cube designers. So I just want to say I really appreciate the risk that you're taking having me on the show today.
Oh my goodness, no, the conga line continues. I am thrilled for you to be here. So normally when we begin these conversations, I like to start with a cube overview and use that as a jumping off point, but that doesn't quite feel appropriate here. You have such a broad creative reach that extends beyond cube. How would you begin to describe what you do in the creative space?
Wow, that's great. I guess I've always been interested in the reactions of people. So I grew up in an extremely small town in Nevada, and I've just sort of moved to bigger and bigger cities ever since. And I've just been fascinated at just like how people act and why they have the reactions they do. And so, I've been creative usually in the sense of like making tools for people or making kind of canvases or, scavenging hunts, treasure hunts, or puzzles or public art that you can kind of climb on or play with and those kinds of things. And, it's always been kind of like a veiled sociological experiment. And Cube really, fits into that. Game design really fits into that. And as soon as I ever got my hands on any kind of video game or like I remember getting like, Worldcraft or not Work, what's that? War,
World of Warcraft?
yeah, and it's not World of Warcraft. It was the one way before that. It's
Oh,
like where they're still like kind of 2D sprites and things. And then you're like, oh, like there's a map editor for it. You're like, oh my gosh, amazing! I can make my own maps in here. And then you just really just get your mind blown about how they tie those pieces of land together, and it kind of auto populates the trees, and then putting all the different little AI. They didn't even call them AI back then, but just seeing how the computer deals with it, or I really kind of started harassing my friends with custom Wolfenstein levels, and you know what I mean, where it's just like these really simple editors, and then when I remember like the Quake editor came out, and you were like, whoa, I can do like 3D stuff. And then I remember making some really just insane Half-Life editors or Half-Life levels but it just my computer couldn't take it. So basically, I just love kind of creating systems for people to play in, and they're not all great. Usually, they make people really mad and frustrated, but I always learn something about humanity through those.
sounds like you would have been the sort of kid that disassembled radios or whatever to figure out how they work.
Oh, I did, and I didn't figure out how they worked at all, but I definitely took apart a lot of them. Yeah, I took apart all of my. Oh my gosh, yeah. So I lived in this really small town. The exact kind of experience that you can imagine a small town where you have to like I quite literally like stacked wood for an old lady for like 3 months to get $17, and then I would order something in the Sears catalog, and it would take 6 months to get to
Oh
my
man.
house, and it's like finally I get like my transformer or something or whatever it is, and then I immediately take it apart, and it just never goes back together the same way again.
But
Um,
mastering the art of being bored, though, I mean, it forces you into being creative in different ways.
yeah, that's what I tell my 7-year-old daughter for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, really,
She
there is an
doesn't
art to
like
that.
it.
But I love in your description of how you're all of those different pieces that were so exciting, that so much of that is building with tools that are extant, like taking pieces of Wolfenstein or any of these other games. It's extant pieces that you're then reassembling, or sometimes, like you said, just taking apart to see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I was a sociology and multimedia double major at U of O, which is basically kind of put me in the perfect place to make propaganda, because you would like essentially learn in sociology class like this is how the media is like selling to you, and then you would go immediately into your multimedia class to be like, let's make an advertisement. And
It's the natural progression here. I can see the lines connecting.
Yeah, no, it was absolutely terrible, and I definitely sold my soul to that for many many years. But on the side, you learn a lot about kind of like what are the very initial things that kind of hook people to start those threads into some creative or exploration into the puzzle or into the mystery. So, if I were to like hide some clue under a park bench, you would want to also put like something on that bench that was very noticeable, like a just a bag with a big red heart on it or something. And so people would see the bench and they would get over there. But like without those first initial threads to things, you need to have the opening of the mystery needs to be really accessible. But then once people are hooked, you can really kind of start to throw in the math equations and references to physics and things like that, where they dive down deeper into the whole. So that was a really nice kind of lesson from sociology and multimedia.
So with backgrounds like that, you could have gone a number of different directions and probably still are, but what makes games a core part of what you like to explore in the meantime?
Yeah, I don't know. Let's see. I think games had a really good time just recently reading The Beauty of Games and also playing Oppression, which is a couple of really fun books. And I also, feel dubious and embarrassed about my scathing review of one of those books. But but it made me think a lot. I've had a lot of great discussions about what games are and thinking about broader definitions of games, and then you sort of start piecing together things in your life. You're like, maybe this is a game, under that definition, etc. What I've really come to with games, and I won't go into the entire sort of thought process, but games really require consent more than anything. It's like the players need to consent that they're going to play a game. And if they're not consenting, then it's not a game. So we've all been there when people are like, "I'm not playing this anymore," and then all of a
Right.
sudden, they're not playing the game, and it's not a game to them anymore. And I think that sort of buy-in to the game is really important, and it's really made me kind of think about media examples. So that's why like Squid Game is a game because everybody there agreed to be there, but Hunger Games is not a game. That's just theater. And so thinking about those moments of like, how do you get buy-in from people so they want to create the system and manipulate the components? That bleeds into all kinds of things in life.
So it sounds like we need to talk to the districts about rebranding Hunger Games here. Um,
Absolutely.
so when you talk about consent, is that the sort of thing that is that what you would think about as in terms of setting expectations when coming to a game, or is it a little more broad than that? Thinking about like, are you even part of a game in the sense?
That's a great question. I think expectations, if you were to kind of couch this in like a set theory idea, consent is kind of the large set, and then expectations are a smaller set within that. So you want to have those expectations. You want to tell people kind of what they're getting into, but you also just want them to just be there and say like, hey, like whatever's going to happen, let's go. I'm in for this weird experience. And that comes up a lot, if we're going to talk about magic at all tonight, in doing these weird little micro experiments and micro metas and things like that, is that you want to just kind of get a group of people that's just down to try whatever, and then you kind of describe like, hey, like this is a terrible environment. You set their expectations. You're like, no one's going to have fun tonight. Everybody's going to be like, at each other's throats, and then people are like, yeah, yeah, and they get excited about that. And so when they realize that, oh, there's only 5 lands in this thing, and we're all going to fight over them or whatever it is, then they're not mad about it.
But it sounds like that's a feasible goal to say we're all going to be incredibly frustrated, but the reward is whoever is frustrated the least, like whoever comes out on top, and that's its own reward in a way.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's really important, especially if you're gonna play D&D or do these kind of more experiential experiments with people, that they kind of know what they're getting into. So like we would do these like D&D things in high school where we would like be playing D&D in some park at night, by candlelight, and
As you do, robes and pitchforks, right?
as one does in the Northwest. Yeah, and you know, with it would be. I would need to make sure before we would start playing to be like, okay, guys, like don't wear any clothes that you care about, and like be, you know, your shoes might get muddy, even though they're like, but we're just gonna be sitting around the picnic table, right? Right? You know. But like just so they know that like when it gets to that point of the story where like, you know, whatever the NPC that was their friend forever has just been like disemboweled, and they have to like follow the entrails through the woods, and then you hand like the actual players a string and you're like, these are the entrails, like follow it through the woods, and then they're actually having to like follow the string through the woods to some terrible thing that you buried in the forest. That they're like, oh yeah, like he told us this was going to be this way. Because if they did wear some nice shoes that day, then they they they're removed from the immersion of the experience, you know. And that same thing goes with like desert cubes, or these like
Yeah,
these
yeah.
kind of situations which are like not really fun if you're used to like just grinding, you know, like the regular kind of magic.
I've really appreciated that element too about a number of your different cube projects that you have listed, for example, where there's a story to it, there's a hook, or like you described earlier, there's the bag with the red heart on it. There's something that draws you in at the front, and then once everybody's on board, you can go a completely different direction from what you would expect.
Yeah, yeah, the little bait and switch is fun for sure.
Before we dive into any particular cube project, if we, as you said, if we even go that way, what does success look like for you on any sort of creative project?
Wow, that's great. I ask other people to tell me their measures of success in a bunch of different areas in my life, and I think it's a really smart question. And I, having it asked to me right now, am totally unprepared. I think that's I mean, it's a great thing to think about, and I don't want to just kind of boil it down to like, well, it's just vibes. I mean, but obviously, it's a huge part of that is just, you know, how you feel about it. But I think for Cube specifically is just like you just want to see people smiling. You want to, like, there's that moment when, I mean, we've all been there when, you know, you've designed a cube and you're drafting, and you know it's like pack 3 or something, and somebody opens up a pack and they're just like, oh my god, this pack is stacked. And you're like, yes, you know that like you didn't put in crazy power outliers, like you're playing some sort of weird like low power thing, but for some reason that one pack is just like vibing with that person, and that person is expressing this wonderful joy because they found some terrible jank synergy that they're like, this is going to work. And that's success, you know. I love that Cube has this alternate success that most games don't have, in the sense that like success when you're playing Magic is winning. You want to win, you know, like success when you're playing Monopoly is like you want to win. Like most games are just like, I'm going to win, I'm going to get the most points, I'm going to beat the boss, etc. But Cube is just like, it's like growing a garden. You're just like, well, like the goal is just beauty. The goal is that you don't really win at growing a garden, you know. Maybe you win if you go and you sort of weed it and whatnot, but it grows and it changes and it dies, and you move on, you grow another one next year, you have different plants in it. And like, you know, I feel like it's more of a gardening success than like a sort of fighting success. um, and it really, it's just joy. You're just looking to make people curious and open their eyes, and just to see those new things. And when you see somebody make those connections that they wouldn't have otherwise made, even if it's just like adding some terrible, you know, 1/1 to their deck, or whether, you know, they found some key under some bench in the woods. Those are wonderful things, you know.
It's interesting. I find that there's this meta connection that you've just described of, you know, you've found this joy of taking different pieces and putting them together in a new way into a smaller set that somebody else is going to take pieces from and make something new from.
Yeah.
Um, like and finding that finding their dopamine button in the things that you have already been excited about is something profound.
I don't know if it's profound. I think it's really we're just living vicariously through each other, and in the worst way of saying it. But also, cube is, maybe you could say it's kind of a practice of empathy. You're really trying to empathize with the players and feel what they're feeling. And the more you can do that, the better the cube is. And the better, like, all of these weird experiments in sociology are, interactive public art and any kind of game design.
In a lot of your cube projects that you've worked on, you seem to be drawn to small format versions. Is what makes those so appealing for you?
Yeah, I spent about 20 years making giant, terrible public art pieces that people could climb on or yell at or twist or push buttons and things like that. And it took a long time to realize that you have to fail early. You want to prototype the thing really early on. So when you finally do make it, it's kind of bulletproof for whatever reason. So these tiny micro formats that I make in Cube are just these. They're just like little experiments to see, just on like, how do these cards interact with each other? How does just this really small little place interact with each other, and what are the tensions, etc. And I had probably the most fun making a 180 card cube, micro ancient times, and we played that with just two other folks, two other dads of kids, and we just kind of treated it like, poker night or whatever the Greatest Generation did. And and we'd come over and we'd talk about being a dad for whatever 2 hours, and then we'd try to play this thing, and we did that every Friday for months and months and months. And it was just wonderful, kind of seeing the evolution of consciousness in this small format. And so, like, immediately, after 4 or 5 times, we would quote unquote solve it. But then somebody would just get like really invested in a particular card, and they're just like, I don't care if it's the wrong choice. I love this card. I'm going to draft it no matter what. And that's a beautiful moment when people start to crystallize these emotions around things. And then that was the time when you add a card to that, you just kind of you it changes the whole vibe of it. And then a cube is not the static thing. It becomes this kind of storytelling. So now every month, or every whatever week that we would play, and I would add one or two cards, and they would come up in this tiny micro format, because every card came up in the micro format, and it would matter so much more, and be like, oh my god, there's that card, and it would start to kind of create this wonderful story, because people would be like, well, I always draft Genesis or whatever it is, and like, and then and like Joe's always drafting I don't know, blue, white, red, and I don't know, it's just great. And so people kind of form their personalities in this micro meta, and then by changing the cards just slightly, it changes kind of this wonderful story. And it really felt like storytelling, more of like a D&D kind of crafting a narrative. And so, then when I ballooned it into, whatever, something for CubeCon, which is like 360, so 8 people could play, it felt like it lost kind of like a lot of that character. And sure, it was, 8 people could play it and whatnot, and it kind of fell into the normal archetypes or themes or whatever that people were used to, and people I didn't know would come, and they'd be like, oh, why is this card in here? And I was like, oh, you don't understand, like, we always do this with that, and they don't know. and I just think that, after doing this experiment, um, I just want to make these tiny little micro formats for people I know, really, more than anything else. Like, just kind of crafting these tiny little boxes of emotions and combinations for people that I know who will like them. Because I don't really have interest in trying to design a cube for the broader Magic community, because I just don't think that makes sense for me right now. I don't really know who they are. I never really was a part of that growing up, and I feel like, I just want these things to be these little custom, it's just these little custom expressions for people. And if other people I don't know like them, awesome. But cube is really just kind of an art form for me that I do just for me and my close friends. And if anybody else likes it, I don't know, you're a weirdo like me. That's great.
I'm glad you described it this way too. I was noting as I was exploring some of the projects you have posted, and that you have this sort of penchant for tension. That there's a lot of people who will approach games as a kind of a way to relieve stress or to relax in some way. But it seems like you really like putting these boxes with really tight corners and creating these edges that players have to navigate. Do you think that comes from like your sociology mind? Do you think that comes from, just different experiences?
Yeah, I think it's because I'm a really bad Magic player. Um,
Well,
and, and I think I'm a much better game designer than I am a Magic player. In the sense that like I low key don't want anybody to win, and you want them to just kind of you want them to just be frustrated and on the verge of winning for as long as possible. That's that tension you want, and so like I lean away from walls. I lean away from, whatever vigilance. I lean away from like all these things that kind of help people feel safe. And you want them, I lean away from tutors, anything that kind of like helps people. And I want them to feel this like wild kind of like, oh, I'm going to top deck a card. I want that card to like slide off the top of that deck like those old, poker movies where they're like, oh, it's the ace of spades, I win. Like you want every moment to be this as high tension as possible, because that's how you forget about the rest of the world. And you're just like totally immersed in that wonderful moment where you're like, is this card going to win me the game? Is the next card on the top of the deck gonna save me? And if I can create a system where a person's just about to lose, and then they draw a card and they just barely don't lose, and they're just about to win, and then the next person's like, crap, the next card has to save me, and then they have that same experience, and it goes back and forth that way. That's kind of like the ideal thing. You have that feel agency, but you also feel just right on the edge of death and success at the same time.
Have you attempted to approach that same sort of sensation with your other types of art pieces?
Well, I mean, putting somebody on the edge of success and death in a public area with public art is not typically like the most legal thing to
I
do.
I realized that as I asked it, yeah.
But I think you want to create that illusion. So like suspending things over people's heads is like definitely a way of doing that for public art. You make like some giant geometric sphere out of who knows what, and you have to sleep at night, so you make sure you spec the right you know bolts and all those other things. But you want people to feel like, yeah, you're like, wow, how's that thing suspended? um, there was a wonderful artist in Boston who I knew, who made giant styrofoam rocks, but they looked exactly like rocks. I mean, they looked just, I don't know how he did it. The most amazing fake rocks you'd ever seen in your life. And he would put them way up in trees, just kind of held just daintily by a couple of branches. And it just felt so awesome. And when you felt this invisible field as you walked under them, even though you kind of knew they were fake. I mean, obviously you knew they were fake, but like they looked so real. And when you walked under them, you felt a little scared. And that's the suspension of disbelief that you want to create in games, or at least I try to.
As you're designing in many different facets, where do you find the balance between theory and practice? You strike
Yeah.
me as a person who enjoys thinking a lot.
Oh, I do enjoy thinking. Absolutely. We had a motto in our public art business: to build is to know. In the sense that you can spend all day in the computer in like these beautiful design softwares, and you're in there and you're engineering everything, and it's just like super perfect, and you're like, this is totally going to work, because look at it, it's all here in 3D, and I've included all the bolts and tolerances, et cetera, I've thought about it all. But then you build it and you're like, oh, I actually can't fit a wrench in there to tighten that nut at all. Like, and you forgot about it. And so to build is to know. So theory is wonderful. And I love thinking about things, and you can get super far into it, but you really don't know until the rubber hits the road. And I think in Cube especially, and in Magic in general, I've moved more into just practice as kind of like the full thing. Like right now I'm just working on just like a no color pie cube where everybody just has prismatic omen, and so like all your lands just tap for whatever. And so we you just think about the abilities, like what the card does. Um, and like, is it going to be just like a terrible mid-range soup? I don't know, probably. But it's just fun to let's just try it. Let's just put together a bunch of cards and let's just test it. Like I can go in and theorize a bit, like, oh, maybe like mill is going to be important or whatever, but you don't really know until you try it. And that's kind of the beauty of cube, really, is that like you kind of need other people. Like it's fun to sit around and write card swaps and stories and think about it, and God knows I do that like 90% of the time. But like a cube is really alive when it's shared.
I one of my friends, his dad was often quoted as saying, "Airplane engineers never have to work on the plane." Kind of this idea that sometimes people who build don't have the good sense of what actually needs to happen on the ground. But you're it sounds like you're really highlighting that you can think all you want, but then there's a moment where it has to just happen before you know.
Yeah, you become a much better designer after you build it, in cube and in life in general. Like if you don't know how things are built, then you're not gonna design it correctly. Like after the first time I built a public art thing that didn't have space for a hand to get in there and turn bolts, it totally changed how everything is designed um, in the future. So yeah, testing and prototyping, failing early, all those things are just real world experiences that you need to have with other people who aren't you. And that all makes you a better designer across all kinds of things in your life.
Well, shall we unpack that just a little bit with a project or two of yours?
Sure.
You mentioned one called Five Alive. Tell me a little bit about this.
Yeah. So Five Alive is just a format that is meant to, I guess, just like cut to the chase. It's basically a format that's designed to just start at the end game. It's 32 cards. You lay them face up on the table and you roto draft your opening hand of 7 cards. So you get to curate your opening hand. And then the rest of the cards get shuffled into a shared library. And so you get to start with just like absolutely awesome cards. And, you have this wonderful back and forth with like roto drafting with people to be like, oh, if I take this, if they go this line, then I have to go this line, and back and forth. And then you start with 5 life, and so basically you're just thrown into the end game with like a really good hand of cards. You have 5 life, and like every decision just like really matters. And the best part about this is that this has been picked up by a number of people on the Discord, and they've made 5 alive decks that are things that I would just never do. Like somebody just picked it up and made like a power maxed version. I have no interest in Power Max, and they're like everything is just like Force of Wills and all these crazy things, and I'm like I have no idea where to start because again I'm not a terribly good Magic player, but I love the idea that it could be a Power Maxed version, or you can make a Five Alive list that's like really low power, where just like a 2/2 is the thing that's going to win the game, and that feels really wonderful to play in that space where it's really low power. And so it was just kind of a format that I put together to just test different power levels, to test the combinations of certain cards. Um, and I absolutely love it. A single game of it takes maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes or something like that. It's one of those things that you can do in between drafts at KubeCon, and it's just really fun to put together and try. I don't really know how long, how many different reps they have. Like maybe you could play the same Five Alive deck 5 or 6 times until you like totally figure out the exact perfect line. Um, but I mean, I think that's fine. I think there's kind of we worry too much about replayability. I think it's fine to just put together wonderful little poems of things and just say like, yeah, you solved it, and that's the poem, and that's what it is, and that's fine, and it's beautiful.
And it sounds like it's a small enough thing that if you like it, you can recreate it in a different way. Or it sounds that you were describing that with some of your smaller cubes with your friends earlier, where you just throw in these small changes along the way and the whole thing changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it'd be pretty easy to just add two new cards into a Five Alive list. Will totally change the demeanor and the meta and everything like that. So I guess it has replayability if you're willing to garden it.
But I like that sense that it doesn't have to. I think that is something that is easy to latch onto, like that this somehow has to be immortal when, I mean, it's a game.
Yeah, there's definitely an assumption, I think, in Cube and in game design in general, that like your audience is everybody and it needs to be as replayable as possible. And that's a wonderful, noble goal, but it also just kind of stifles a lot of these passionate little ideas that can crop up. And I just follow those ideas because I don't really care. And like anybody that follows me probably knows that, like, oh, he just went off and wrote like 10 pages in a card swap about aliens, and like like this is just like an art form to me, and I don't really it doesn't really matter to me. No one's going to be taking these things seriously, and that's fine. I just want people to kind of express themselves through magic more, and I think these are just fun examples of that.
I had one other project of yours that I wanted to mention briefly that I really enjoyed, called Dream States.
Oh yeah, that dream states is a trip, absolutely, yeah.
So I think this encapsulates so many of the things you talked about too, where it's small, unsurprisingly, but it's also just small tools to adjust how you engage with the game otherwise. Like it's something you would add to an extant draft.
Right, yeah. So in the last KubeCon, there was a concession for emblems. So basically, the organizers said, well, you can have a cube if it like has it can't be a bunch of custom cards. You can't just like make up random cards. Huge bummer to me. I love redacting things and like making up custom cards. It's super cool. Obviously, I mean anybody could have guessed that. And
Oh yeah.
but so the cube con organizers like, well, okay, so if there's a single emblem, then you can have it in the main game. So like turbo cube's a great example that like the emblem is something that reduces all the costs of everything. And so I was like, well, I really like that. Like, can we just kind of could we make like just a pile of emblems and just have those influence any game that you play? And so that's basically what Dream States is essentially just a pile of emblems that you just pull a couple random ones before you play whatever it is. Like it could be any cube, really. You can add that onto. And the emblems I tried to choose very specifically to be things that affect both players and that are kind of really easily readable as being affecting both players. So it doesn't say you or anything like that. And they're the things that you would expect. There's just like mana burn or like these clocks, that like take people's life down, or like, every turn you get to like cheat a creature into play. And we've played multiple games with the dream states on top of um, ancient times, and it is just absolutely hilarious. Like it kind of throws drafting out the window because you're like, I don't really know even how to draft to 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 expect this random emblem package. Um, so people are just like, well, I'm just going to draft a bunch of like kind of like low bad creatures and then just like see what happens. And it is absolutely hilarious. Like it's those moments where people are when you flip over those emblems in the beginning and you're like, oh my gosh, like these are the two emblems I'm playing with, and like people's minds are blown, and then they have like these really wild like emotional games. And it has almost nothing to do with what they drafted, but they have a great time.
And I can link these in the description as well. But these are all just enchantments from across the game's history that do something, or artifacts that do something wild, like the
Pretty much,
eponymous
yeah.
dream halls or fecundity or something.
Dream Halls is great. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, those are the kind of things. Like I have kind of like a really weird relationship with media and games in general, coming from a background in college and just doing advertising for so long. I just don't think anything is sacred anymore. So like even playing Magic or the game of Magic is it's just not a sacred thing. And like I love just messing it up with terrible rules or restrictions or custom cards and things like that. I'm like, I know that we just went through this wild thing. We saw everybody redact cards like crazy on Reddit, but I love that. I think that's absolutely wonderful. Joe and I are thinking about making a cube that is all about just sort of fighting with someone else about the rules. So you basically redact a card in a way that just kind of makes no sense. So like the words are kind of like a jumble, and then you have to argue and vote like what that card means with the table, and then you have to play it that way. So you just like really heightens the interaction with players. I know that sounds probably terrible to anybody who isn't like good friends with everyone else in the play group, but I don't know, it could be
But
fun.
but this is the same thing. This is the thing, like, where you're creating that tension again. You're pushing people into new spaces to experience something different. Plus, this is like right in line with the alpha rule book. The original ruling was if two players disagreed on how a card was to be played, you flipped a coin, and whoever won the flip got to play it that way for the rest of the match.
No way.
Oh yeah. So we're
uh,
coming full circle here, DSB.
oh man. Okay, that's I don't have any tattoos, but I think that's up there. Just that ruling, absolutely.
Well, we've covered a lot of really good ground here. What advice, as you think back on this, would you offer to another cube designer or just a creative? How would what advice would you give them as they're considering their own projects?
I think you got to make things for you to start with. Uh, it's just got to be something that you just really like. And then, maybe halfway through, start thinking about other people to be like, you know, gosh, if somebody walked in on me doing this right now, like, what would they think? But like, you gotta start for you, and just sink your teeth in and just figure out how you think and what you like. I think a lot of people just don't know what they like. We're told to like all kinds of things by the media in all kinds of terrible ways, and and I'm responsible for telling people how to think. Uh, a lot of it, man, I made some terrible advertisements that I will never, my karma will never recover from. But I think any creative just needs to just really figure out what really they like as a person, and make art about that, and then there's that terrible moment where you're like, am I going to share this with the
Yeah.
world? And that's a totally different thing. Um, and maybe if you make what you like and you share it with the world, and then you get to the terrible step of being like, well, do I call myself an artist? Like, what does that even mean? And I don't think you need to do that. I don't think labels really matter. But I mean, I just want people making art and being creative, um, and just doing things that they like, doing creative things that they love and that they can't explain to other people. We all have those movies that we just love but can't recommend to anybody. It's that emotion where you're like, oh, I drew this picture that I absolutely love, but man, if I show it to somebody, they're going to ask like what these dots are or whatever, and I'm not going to be able to explain myself. But that feeling of not being able to explain yourself, that shouldn't stop you from making that picture. So my advice to creatives is just like figure out what you like and just make it for you, and then down the road figure out how to deal with society.
That's spectacular. Well, one of my favorite questions to ask by way of wrap up here: if you could have any magic card reprinted as a promo, what card would it be, and who would you have do the illustration?
I love this question. I think it would be Gilded Drake, and I would want the artist to be Wayne Barlow. He's not a magic artist, but he's a wonderful thinker and artist that is responsible for so many creatures that we take for granted in film. Also, Gilded Drake is just one of these beautiful cards that if you're I like the power level. If you have a power level where Gilded Drake is an actual kind of choice, where you're like, do I really want to give them a flyer, a 3/3 flyer? Like that's perfect. So Gilded Drake with Wayne Barlow would be the one for me.
And if you have never seen Wayne Barlow's art, as I am discovering now for the first time, this is fascinating stuff. Really worth the exploration and a really striking style for this sort of card, too.
Yeah, beautiful thinker. He's done so much work just designing this entire beautiful world of hell with just hierarchies and like politics and angels. And he also went just really deep into like an entirely new ecosystem on a planet, Darwin 5, like just really deep thinker in like the musculature and ecosystem of things. So he's been somebody I've followed since I was since I was very little. I have these old books on my shelf that smell a certain way of his. You know, those books that smell a certain way.
Mhm.
Okay.
Absolutely. Oh, no, no, it's
And
exactly
it's
like
like this crazy memories come out of those smells. And I don't know, maybe it's the glue was different back then or it's changed throughout the years, but man, it just transports me.
DSB, this has been just a wonderful conversation. Just so many fun things to explore and tense things to explore, I suppose, as it goes. I mean, I really appreciate you taking time to be part of this.
It is an honor and a privilege. It really is. Like I think your podcast is just it's blowing up. Everybody's loving what you're doing, and I really hope you continue to find time to do it. So I thank you so much.
Oh man, you are far too kind. Well, if people want to pursue any of the projects you're doing or maybe connect to, to just explore, engage perhaps in like the nonchalant apophenia sorts of things,
Sure.
where should we point them?
Well, you should find me on Discord. I hang out in MTG Cube Talk Discord as D.S.B. and on Cube Cobra as D.S.B. Cubes is my name. And yeah, hit me up, comment on stuff. Let's get weird. Totally.
Well, again, thank you so much for your time. I'm thrilled to have gotten to do this. Looking forward to connecting again soon.
Thank you so much, Kate.